In this video, what we're going to be doing before we move on to creating some of the descriptive statistics that we did in the previous video in Excel, we're first going to just give you a crash course on Excel formulae and some of the shortcuts that you may not be aware of, and also give you an introduction to the if function, which we'll be using in our later video. In this section, we're going to once again be using the master list data that we used in the previous video, and you can download this from the link below in the video description. We're going to be using the master list data directly downloaded from the DBE website. So like Chris showed you in a previous video, you first need to, if you haven't already, remove the filters. And what we want to do is use formulae and shortcuts in order to work out certain variables, maybe summing things, counting things. So the first thing we're going to do is just do a simple count of the educators in the country and the learners that exist in the country to show you how formulae work. I'll show you first without it being formatted as a table, as this data, and then we'll format it as a table, which makes it a little bit easier to work with. So if you're at the start of the data, we want to go to the end of the data with Control and End. This takes us, so this column over here is the learners in each school, and this column here is the educators in each school. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to figure out the count of learners in the country according to the master list. One shortcut that Excel has, or quicker way to do it rather than typing out the formula, so we can just click on this sum over here, and it brings up the sum of all of the values, but it's up until the first blank space. So if we just press enter over here, you can see that the number is 3.1 million. And we know that there are more than 3.1 million learners in the data set. So there's something going wrong over here. What we can do to correct this, so if we did scroll up, you'll see it's selected all the way up until there is a blank space. There's lots of data over here, so the scrolling would take a while. But you can check this in your own time, and if you do scroll up, you'll see that it stops when we get to missing data, and often in the data we work with, there are missing values. So a way to correct this is we can manually edit this formula in the bar over here, where my cursor is. We can manually edit this formula so that it's selecting all the way from the start of the data, so from this cell over here, which is A2. So if we edit this and just change this number over here to a 2, we're moving it then, and we're selecting all our data, and the count now is 13.4 million, which is closer to what we would expect. So one way of doing it is what we did right over there with clicking on the shortcut button. Another way of doing this, if we just undo what we've just done with Control Z, another way of doing it is to rather use the shortcut Alt and equals. So if we press Alt and equals, that also automatically sums up everything up until the first blank. Once again, we have to edit this so that it includes all of our data. So it goes from AU2 all the way up to the end, and we get the same value. If we want to perform the same action, so here we've summed all of the values in a column. If we want to perform the same formula, essentially, or the same action on values that are just next to it, one thing we can do is we can take our cursor, and if you drag it down to the bottom right of your cell, you can see that the cursor changes from a big plus to a thin black plus, and you can just click and you can drag it across. And what this has now done is it's added, if we look at the formula, it's added all of the values in this column. So it's added up all the educators, and it's got that we have 463,000 educators. So an alternative to doing what we just did, which was clicking and dragging across, is if we click in the cell that we want to copy it across to, we can instead use the keyboard shortcut Control and R, and that then uses the same formula, but in the cell that we are currently selecting, also to do the educator count. Something else we might want to do is work with our data before we move it into a pivot table and calculate statistics that might be relevant or important. So sticking with the master list, perhaps we want to figure out what is the learner-educator ratio, or the LER, for each school. So to do that, we want to divide the total number of learners by the total number of educators. So we can type our formula in Excel Whenever you're typing a formula, you want to start with an equals. Here we don't have to use a command because we're just doing simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. So we take the number of learners, so in this cell, and we divide it, which is the slash, by the number of educators. And we get that for this school, it's 8.92. What we can do as well, so we could manually type this formula in every single cell, but that would take forever because it's a very big data set. We could also click and you can drag it down to copy like we dragged previously. But once again, this is a very long data set, so that will take a lot of time. So a much quicker way to do this is if you move your cursor to the place where you would usually drag it down, and you see that it turns to the thin black cross. If you just double click on that point, it copies the formula down for the rest of the data. So if you click here, for example, and see what is Excel busy doing, you can see it is still taking this cell, the AU76, and dividing it by the one that it's next to it. We can also, Chris showed in a previous video, formatting and making things look better. Maybe for the learner-educator ratio, we want to rather have it that it is in 1 or 2 decimal points. It's a matter of personal preference. Something you can do for that is if you select your data, so Control, Shift, and down to select all of that data. If we go back to our home ribbon and look at this over here, the increased decimal or the decreased decimal, we want to decrease the number of decimal places. So we can click on that until we get to the number of decimals that we're happy with. What we're now going to look at is how to do a basic if function. So there are a variety of functions that you can do in Excel. You are able to find other resources online for using Excel formulae. We're just showing you something that's specific that we'll be using in one of the later sessions, but it's also a slightly more advanced formula that is very useful. The if statement or an if function is basically giving Excel instructions that it wants to look for a certain condition, what we'll call the conditional statement. And if that is true, it does something. And if it is not true, it does something else. And we're going to tell it what to do in both of those instances. Perhaps here we want to identify schools that have learner-educator ratios of 40 or more, so more than 40 learners per teacher. I'll create a new column and I will call this LER greater than or equal to 40. To start off with our if statement, we start with the equal because we're doing a formula. It's if. We open our brackets and then we write the statement or what we want Excel to essentially do. What we want Excel to do is we want to say, if this over here, the learner-educator ratio, is greater than or equal to 40. So that is what it calls the logical test. If that is true, we want it to write yes. And because it's text, I put it in quotes. If I wanted it to put a value over there, then I wouldn't need to use quotes. I could just write the number directly. So if it's true, we want it to say yes. If it is false, so if the learner-education ratio is not greater than or equal to 40, then we want it to write no. Also in quotes because it's text. And then we close the brackets, press enter, and you can see over here that it has now done exactly what we asked it to do. So is 8.93 greater than or equal to 40? No, it is not. So we've got our formula. What we can do is we can copy it down for the rest of the schools in the data with the same method as previously. So we move our cursor to the bottom right, we double click, it copies it down. And now what we can do is just to check that it works, you can see none of these values over here are greater than 40 and all of them do say no. And if we scroll until we find a yes, over here we have a school where the learner-educator ratio is 44. 44 is greater than 40. So Excel therefore wrote yes. So that's just to check that our function works. And you can do this. What we'll do in a later session is looking at marks meeting certain thresholds or not. And that can be useful statistics for you to do using Excel. An alternative to using the formula that I've just showed you is if we format our data as a table in Excel, that helps us to avoid some of those extra steps. So if we start with our master list from scratch again, before we did the if statement or any of the formulae, and if we just go Control A to select our entire table and then click Format as Table, our table does have headers, so we keep that selected and we click OK. Our table is now recognized as a table in Excel. And something that's quite useful is if we go to the table design ribbon, you can see that there's an option that says total row. If we select that, at the end of your table, we now have a new row called total. And we can now go across. So where previously, when we got to the learners and to the educators, we had to insert a formula either with the shortcuts or with the buttons or manually typing it. Now, because Excel knows that it's a table, it can do this automatically. So it's already added up the educators in our data set. If we click on the drop-down list next to it, you can see that currently this is showing the sum. We could also show something like the average. So on average, how many teachers are there per school? 18.67. We can also do this for any of the columns in our data. So if we wanted to do this for learners and get the count of learners, we can click on that cell at the bottom of the row, click on the drop-down, and we can then go and find the sum option. So there we get that 13.4 million learners. We could figure out what is the average number of learners per school, and we get a different number. So this is one of the advantages of formatting your table as a table. It automatically recognizes and can do formulae for the data, and then you don't have to worry about things like the missing spaces that we encountered earlier. One last thing we'll show you in this section is how Excel recognizes numbers often as a formula, and that speeds things up as well. So if we go back to the start of our table with Control and Home, and we insert a column, either using one of the shortcuts or right-clicking like I did over here, and we call this number. Let's say we want to just automatically number the schools from 1 all the way to the end. If you start writing the sequence that you want Excel to follow, so we want it to go 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to the end, we don't have to write a formula for this. We can just write the first couple of numbers, and if we double-click to copy the formula down for the rest of the data set, you can see it just continues the pattern that we started. And if we go all the way to the end of our data, you can see it goes up to 24981, which is the number of schools that we have in our data. We could do a different pattern as well. Let's say for some reason you wanted to go up in increments of 3, so 3, 6, and 9. If we copied that down, Excel would also just continue that formula or continue that pattern onwards down the data. So that's another shortcut. There are a lot of other ways to use formulae in Excel to speed up your workflow and makes things a lot faster or automated, so you're not having to manually type things in. But these are the relevant things for today's session. What we're going to do in the next video is move on and look at using pivot tables and formulae in order to get some of the basic descriptive statistics that were discussed in the theory lecture in the previous video.